Can we have a round of applause for Colin Patterson? I forgot to ask, is the sound okay back there? You can hear it all right? A bit louder, would be good.
Thanks, John. Thanks for that welcome, John. And I thought he's just about given my talk for me already, but I hope there's a few other bits and pieces I can throw in. I will be talking about material, as John said, that is found in this book. Now, I'm not interested in getting money from sales. I'm not interested in getting good rankings on Amazon book sales. I'm really not even interested in being linked with the ideas in the book. But what I am interested in is the ideas themselves and their dissemination, their spread, because I think that some of them are useful for the task of renewing the church in Melbourne. And that's a task that many of us hold dear as believers. So that's why I will refer to it, not because I'm seeking sales. There are some copies down the back there for sale afterwards if you would like to purchase them. The book actually hasn't been launched yet, but these are pre-launch copies that are available if you'd like later. Imagine this fictitious little scenario. I'm 30 years younger, and I'm with about half a dozen of my work colleagues after work. We're standing around in a pub, enjoying a pint, and we're just talking over various topics that that groups of fellas like to talk about. Everybody's involved, but there's one person who seems to have more to say than the others, and the rest of us kind of look up to him because whenever he cracks a joke, we usually laugh pretty well, even though some of his jokes are pretty lame. And eventually the topic of conversation turns towards the question of the approaching state election. And so there we are, we're wondering, what's going to happen. Is Dan Andrews going to get back in again? And what's this fellow Matthew Guy about? What do you know about him, etc., etc. And then somebody turns and they say to me, "Hey Colin, you're pretty high up in the Labor Party, aren't you? You're on committees and that kind of thing. What's going on?" And of course, all eyes turn on me. They're all listening to what I have to say because it's true, I'm a heavy in the Labor Party, and I know stuff that isn't common knowledge amongst the public. So there I am. I'm happy enough to talk about what I know and let them in on some of the inner workings of politics in Victoria. As I'm talking, somebody in the group says, "Colin, I'm not sure you're right on that, what you said about Dan Andrews." Proceeds to give a couple of reasons for his questioning of my knowledge. And at that point I have two options. I can either pretty heavily put him back in his box and say, "Look, what you need to understand is such and such and such and such." That's one option. Or I could be a little gentler and say, "Yeah, what you say is half true, but you need to consider this as well." And so, of course, I choose a second option, and so we're still friends today. This little vignette of common life that's common amongst many people today, contains some elements of what psychologists call dominant behaviour. The fellow who who kind of leads the conversation, who talks much, who seems to have a view, an authoritative view on just about every topic that comes up. The change of dynamic where the focus turns upon me. The challenge of my superior knowledge about state politics, etc. All of these things are part of this dominance motive that we have. It's a mechanism inside our brain. It's quite a specific thing, and it is very, very powerful. You may have heard of it. You may have heard Dr Peterson talk about dominance in relation to lobsters. And the reason he refers to that is because dominance is a very, very old process that precedes humans by hundreds of millions of years. And even what we would consider simple animals like lobsters engage in dominance behaviour. And so we need to try and understand how it works with humans. I mean, we see it in animals when two stags are butting antlers together, or when rams are butting heads together, or dogs fighting in the street, or humans trying to work out who has the superior knowledge about state politics. It's all the same thing. It's all dominance behaviour. Now, if you think about it a little bit, you'll realise that there are hundreds of ways that we humans compare ourselves on various hierarchies, rankings of status, pecking orders. They're all the same thing. For example, when Year 12 students come to put down their selections for the courses at tertiary institutions that they want to go to if their marks are good enough, the ordering that they put them in and the top one that they put them in, these are all related to questions of the status of the course. And or very wealthy people. These are people who are much wealthier than most of us. These are considered as higher up a pecking order than the rest of us mortals. Or you might be a chess grandmaster, or you might be a high-earning barrister or a medical specialist. You might win awards for your garden. There's all sorts of things that you can be compared on and work your way up, or end up being lowly. The key thing that I want to get across to you tonight about dominance is not only that it's very, very powerful, but that it is the primary motive for our everyday life, our thinking. It's something that touches us right here and now, all of us. John mentioned a personality that was dominant, and we recognise that, but what I'm wanting to say also is that we are all involved in this, not just people that are conscious of wanting to be top dog, as it were. And so when we talk about self-image or your self-consciousness, your self-esteem, self-respect, these are all driven underneath, out of our awareness, by this mechanism that we call dominance, that, as I said, is based on something that's in our biology, not something that we think of. It's based fundamentally at a biological level. So it's a very important thing to come to terms with. Now you might be wondering, why is it that we humans operate this way? Why is it that we have this mechanism that is so powerful and so pervasive in our everyday life? And the reason for that is that nature has evolved this mechanism to help improve the chances of survival of our species. Think about it. If an attractive, single, healthy, warm personality woman comes across a group of men, she'll be attracted to the man, assuming the normal heterosexual kind of connection between men and women. She'll be attracted to the one who is a better physical specimen, the one who is more confident, more successful, one who has a stable and a caring personality. And if it should happen that they pair up and marry, according to the laws of genetics, their offspring will be like them, healthier, successful, good-looking, etc. And they, in turn, when they come to pair off, will have children of a similar kind. In other words, the species, and whether it be humans or tigers or magpies or whatever, the species is more likely to survive if the dominant members of that species pair up and have offspring. They're more likely to survive because health is one of those elements of dominance in animals, and the other kind of consequence applies to the less dominant members of the species. So you can see how it kind of works. It helps to sustain a species over generations. So as I say, dominance is a very important part of life for every one of us. But let me introduce to you a scriptural spanner in the works. This is just a passage out of the Gospels, out of Mark. And they came to Capernaum, and when Jesus was in the house, he asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But the disciples kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And Jesus sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." You know that reading, you know that there are many other similar readings within the Gospels about Jesus teaching on these kind of things, and you can see from it that Jesus strongly warns his followers to be careful of those things that dominance produces. So there's this enormous mismatch between the most powerful force in the human psyche and, for believers, the most powerful person in their life. Tremendous mismatch, it seems. Do we simply suppress our dominance motive? Or are there other ways to bring into a kind of an alignment these two elements in the life of a believer? Unfortunately, I haven't got time to spell out how this might work its way through, and I do talk about it in the book at some depth. But as a very short answer, to not push the book too much, as a very short answer, I would just say that yes, there are parts of the dominance motive, parts of it that are quite conforming with the way of Jesus Christ. But that's just to say, yes, what seems to be a terrible mismatch doesn't have to be. Now, I've said that dominance is the most powerful motive in our minds, but it's not the most important. That honour goes to another motive that I will introduce to you just with a couple of illustrations. In 1993, my father died of a blood clot to the lungs. I can still vividly remember driving up to my parents' home, greeting my family, going into the bedroom, and spending a few minutes with my dad, or what was left of him. During that time, and immediately in the following days, I was in a state of shock. In the weeks and months after that, as the shock subsided, I found that my mood was down, it was lowered, it was a depressed mood, as you'd understand, and my mind was distracted and unsettled. One moment I'd be involved in my work, and suddenly something would trigger a memory of my dad, and I'd suddenly and painfully realise that he was no longer with us. I'd be shaving with soap and brush and razor in the morning, and a wave of sadness and tears would overwhelm me as I remembered watching my dad do exactly the same thing when I was a young boy. What's going on when the dark recesses of our mind take over the process of dealing with such a loss? What's going on that our mind has a mechanism of kind of drip feeding the pain rather than just overwhelming us with the whole task of coming to terms with this loss? Let's consider another example. As a student at uni in the 1970s, I met a young woman at a church youth group. I began taking her home to her house after meetings of the youth group. We soon became good friends, found ourselves talking at length about our thoughts, our past life, our experiences, our inner souls, as it were, until eventually we, as they say, became an item. I don't know what they say today. Maybe there's no such thing anymore. But anyway, we did, and it was sealed with our first kiss. And I can remember driving home in my car from that event and just being struck by how happy I was. And the next day in the university library, I was just sitting there. I had no capacity whatsoever to concentrate on my studies. I was just thinking about this young woman. I mean, to think that someone had got to know me in my inner being and yet could love me and accept me and could allow me to get to know her, that was really a life-changing experience. both those examples that I've given you illustrate what's called the attachment motive. The attachment motive. Now, in this case, you might imagine that attachment is a specifically human motive because it's to do with the inner self and that kind of thing. But the reality is that attachment is, well, it's almost as old as the dominance motive. It's that old, and we find it in animals. Let me just say, again, I can't really explain too much here, but the attachment motive shows itself, for example, when ducklings follow after the mother duck. When young monkey sees a predator and draws close to its mother for protection, just like a young child does when a stranger walks through the door. In fact, romantic and marriage relationships, on the one hand, and parent relationships, parent-child relationships to do with security, are both driven by the attachment motive. Again, I'll say just two things about it to help you get a better sense of what I'm talking about when I talk about attachment. First, attachment relationships are not just any old relationships that we have. We have lots of relationships with lots of different people, friendships, etc. But attachment relationships are quite specific in their mechanism. Again, there are a mechanism in the brain that works given certain triggers, etc. They have specifically to do with our relationship with our mum and dad, and how we relate to our husband or wife. To a lesser extent, we can also have attachment relationships with our brothers and sisters, with our grandparents, perhaps a very few other relationships that we have. But we also can have a kind of an attachment relationship in our sense of security that we are unaware of but exists when we live in a particular country and know its culture and that kind of thing. There's an element of attachment there as well. In fact, understanding attachment is quite a difficult thing, and I can say this, that it took me quite a long time working as a psychologist to get a rough and ready understanding of what it's about. But it is crucially valuable in understanding it in our lives. The second thing I'd say about attachment is that you can kind of get a sense of when it occurs by saying, are these two things present? Firstly, emotional vulnerability, and secondly, emotional care, emotional warmth. Those two things together. Vulnerability, that is a sincere opening up of our inner selves, especially the weak or the more shameful parts. And warmth, the gentleness and attentive care that we receive when we're vulnerable. And that's the hope anyway. Those two things together, vulnerability and care together, signify the presence of an attachment relationship or the developing of one. Now, of course, many things can go wrong with close relationships, we know that. Parent-child, husband and wife, and they can disturb and distort those relationships. So, for example, perhaps when we were little, our mother was not very responsive to us when we felt anxious or scared, or she might have frequently criticised us when we were psychologically vulnerable. And so we would have grown up with an expectation that the world was somewhat uncertain and threatening place. And this has made us a bit insecure and clingy or emotionally needy in our intimate or close relationships. Or worse, we might have been emotionally neglected or even abandoned emotionally or physically by our parents, and so we grow up with an expectation that we're the only ones that can look after ourselves. We can't rely upon other people, and so we don't entrust ourselves to others. Or, alternatively, we grew up in warm and responsive families, parents who gave us a sense of security and secure boundaries, discipline, etc., who supported us when we were vulnerable. And so when we came to adulthood, we assumed that the world was a place that was pretty safe with people who would accept us. Now, perhaps none of us had a perfect upbringing, and probably we've all got little elements of insecurity or uncertainty about ourselves. But the key point to keep in mind is this, that attachment is most formative during the first 3 years of life, from 0 to 3. And the interesting thing is that what happens, especially during those years, can shape the way we approach life, basically. That's not to say that it's fixed, because we know that deep intimate relationships later in life can heal pains and sufferings and earlier distortions and such. But it is to say that those first 3 years are indeed very important for us. So let me conclude this comment on attachment by saying this, that attachment is a kind of a counterweight to dominance. Whereas dominance is all about presenting our best selves to the public, about showing our abilities and other qualities in their best light, and about being better than the next guy. Attachment, on the other hand, is about bringing together, binding people together, as it were, about taking a break from the pressures of dominance. And so we need attachment bonds, not least to allow us some respite, as it were, from the pressures of dominance behaviour that drive us. I hope you're following me so far. Really, I'm just offering comments on 2 of what I've written about, of 5 important motives, and these are pretty important in determining how we think and feel and behave and such in our daily lives. A moment ago, I mentioned that attachment was a way of kind of having respite, as it were, from dominance demands on us. In view of that, consider these passages from the Bible. Psalm 62. O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and glory. Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. For you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy. My soul clings to you, your right hand upholds me. Familiar words? What do you hear there? Powerful attachment sentiments are being expressed in that psalm. Attachment to God, in other words. Or what about this passage from the Sermon on the Mount? Jesus said to his disciples, pray like this: Our Father in heaven, our Father in heaven. A bit later in Matthew's Gospel we read Jesus' words, come to me all who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Again, as you know, those kind of passages could be multiplied many times, saying the same kind of thing. God is like a loving Father, one who knows our weaknesses and yet still accepts us, one with whom we can be totally honest, totally vulnerable, because he is one who is trustworthy. I hope you can see the attachment themes coming through those passages. What is distinctive about the Christian faith is that God has demonstrated his care for us, his nearness to us, by coming to us in his Son, Jesus Christ. He can say to me, for example, I know what it's like to be a human, Colin. And all of that guilt, all of that shame, all of that stuff you're embarrassed about, that you really don't even want to think about yourself, all of that stuff I have taken and I have utterly destroyed it on the cross. I am now a truly free man, and all of those concerns that I had about seeking to impress others and to move up hierarchies and rankings and improving my status, all of that kind of thing, that sort of thing no longer need consume my conscious life. Growing attached to God, and that's what the Christian faith is about. The psychological mechanism is there. Growing attached to God, to Jesus Christ, God made man, this is a lifelong journey. My own path began when I was a young boy. My parents took me to Sunday school and I learned about Jesus Christ. I learned to respect God. It developed in my teenage years, and when I came to know myself having been addressed by Jesus Christ, and I was surprised, I was caught by surprise by Christ's presence in my life. And then over the years and decades, I guess things developed, and about 20 years ago I was received into the Catholic Church, and there I experienced a powerful sense of a spiritual coming home, of truly entering Christ's home on earth. This was a sense I had. I'm sure there are others here who have had a similar sense as that. Of course, the journey continues, and I hope I seek to continue to grow in my attachment to God. I should say, of course, immediately that our relationship with Christ is fundamentally about God's grace. We don't work at pursuing it and trying to establish that kind of attachment relationship. But God uses the way He's made us, our nature, and He builds on that. So He uses the mechanisms that we have to develop attachment to then, by His grace, bring us into a closer relationship with Himself. The reason why I emphasise this is because I firmly believe that the experience of being a disciple, a follower of Jesus, of being obedient to Him, that experience is in a major way established first by that attachment relationship with God, so that after that, being obedient to Him then becomes a whole lot easier. Without that attachment relationship to God, the requirements of discipleship kind of overwhelm us, and we have that feeling of, oh, do I really want to go to Mass on Sunday, etc. That kind of oughtness crushes us. Jesus said, take my yoke, because it's a light one. It's a light yoke. So, I hope you can see that while I earlier said that dominance is the most powerful motive in our lives, the most important one is in fact the dominance, the attachment relationship, because it's the one upon which our relationship with Christ is built. Our salvation is really dependent upon that. The world that we enter into, when we understand, at least to some extent, the motives that drive our thoughts and our actions, is a fascinating one, full of discoveries about ourselves, full of discoveries about how other people operate as well. And we have to recognise that it's a world that was largely unknown to our brothers and sisters of former centuries. Bringing it all into connection with our faith, finding out how the Word of God evaluates this world, this task is a great challenge for us in our time, but also a wonderful opportunity to grow in our faith, to really shine a light within our hearts, to understand what's it like inside, under the surface. I encourage you not to just set it aside, but to follow it up, so that you might be able to better fulfil the Lord's purpose for your life, and as you're able to assist your other brothers and sisters in Christ on their journey towards meeting Him, Christ Jesus, face to face. Thank you.
Happy to take any questions, Colin.
Good hope.
Does anyone have a question?
Thank you very much for your talk. I can't even begin saying thank you enough. Just regarding, you said the indicators for attachment to be present is the emotional vulnerability and the caregiving. Are they indicators for it to be present, or do you feel like there will just be like fertile ground for it to occur? Or are there? I'm not asking for any reason, I'm just asking to see if that automatically, when I see those two, then it's an indicator, or whether they're just fertile grounds. They may be present, but no attachment is formed.
You might sort of repeat the question.
As I understand your question, thank you for it. The question was, does attachment automatically occur, develop, if there is present emotional vulnerability on the one hand and emotional caring and support on the other? Or is it really a matter of those two things being fertile ground for attachment to develop? And that's a useful question to consider, because it might seem as if it's fertile ground and that it doesn't really operate automatically, but interestingly enough, it is almost automatic. In fact, I don't know whether this is a very good example to illustrate it, but I'll take the risk. When couples first make love, especially for the female part of that relationship, there is almost automatically an emotional vulnerability and opening up to the partner. That seems to be not under conscious control, but just kind of happens. And it's almost like, goodness, what's going on? Is this just an unconscious process? And that's just a kind of an example of how these sort of things operate. They're much less under our conscious control than we imagine. And so emotional vulnerability and reciprocal care and support, they're almost bound to develop some kind of attachment there. But of course, attachment, well, in a romantic relationship, it takes about a year for a strong relationship, a strong attachment to form, and after that, it's very hard to give it up, very hard. So just a one-off instance of warmth and vulnerability isn't going to develop a strong relationship, but it's going to set the path for it. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks again for the talk, it was great. You said, I think, that the first 3 years of life are critical for developing that kind of healthy attachment. What is it in the first 3 years of life that, if you've got kids, that you can be doing to kind of confer that, and why is that stage so critical, I think, for people?
I don't believe that there is a good explanation yet as to why that period is critical. I mean, we're more like animals in the first 3 years of life. That's just the way we are. We don't think very much, and so we're beholden to our more animal natures, animal processes, and so nature works right from the word go. Why is it that a newborn infant can discriminate between its mother's body smell and another woman's body smell? I mean, these are amazing things, So all of those processes are quite kind of natural, and we've really got to look to how animals deal with these things to get a good idea of what's good for us humans. And unfortunately, our culture is really working against us. Just to throw in another little idea, our culture is dominance heavy and attachment poor, and so we don't really know how to sustain attachment relationships very well. But as long as we're around and responsive to children, that's the main thing. It's not quality, it's quantity. And the other thing to say, of course, is that after about the age of 3, children can start to recognise that when their parents aren't there with them, that they still exist. You ever imagine that? Can you imagine that a 2-year-old child, when their parents go away, they're kind of like as if the parents don't exist, like this terrible trauma, but there's cognitive elements, in other words, to it that come into the picture. So that's why 3 is an important age. That's why my advice always is, as far as you're able, just hang around your children up to that age. Don't be persuaded by all the excellent arguments that are offered to do something different.
I'm curious if
if you or if any other psychologists have tried to look at the person of Jesus in terms of these instincts, dominance and attachment, and see, I don't know, what can we say about Jesus on any of those fronts? Do you know if anyone's tried to do that? Have you tried to do that? Was Jesus a dominant personality?
Well, I mean, he started off on the wrong foot by growing up in Nazareth. Because if you've ever been to northern Israel, you try and find Nazareth. It was a whole of a place and really very small in Jesus' time. So somebody could say, can anything good come from Nazareth? So that was a bad start, but he was able to call disciples to follow him. He had a few tricks up his sleeve. He had a power of miracles, healing and whatever. That certainly helps. But I think that he sidestepped the whole dominance hierarchy thing, which is what followers of Christ need to do as well. Sidestep it, don't be part of it, which is really hard, very difficult, as I say, to really get it right. But Jesus was obviously in a deep attachment relationship with the Father, and so he wasn't quite so fussed about being the top dog. He was quite willing to suffer the humiliation of arrest and treatment, etc., etc. I mean, if you read the gospel accounts of Jesus appearing before Pilate, you can see the gospel writers really hating this humiliation of Jesus, and that they want him to kind of say, well, I can call down my troops and knock you off if I really want to, So they really found it difficult themselves because they're in a culture that's so dominance-driven that they couldn't really grasp that Christ was willing to just cop whatever came his way because he knew where he was heading. He knew that's where he had to end up. So, I wouldn't like to consider Christ psychologically on the basis of the gospel accounts, but my sense is that he got it pretty right.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. Thinking about the dominance hierarchy as Christians, we obviously don't want to dominate others, but then I think we don't also want to fall too far the other way and in the name of turning the other cheek, allow bad behaviour or allow ourselves to be bullied or dominated.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we find the self-awareness to know where we sit in the hierarchy? Sometimes if we are more dominant, we still see ourselves as victims and think, oh no, I'm just trying to assert myself. Mm-hmm. Or if we're less than we need to speak up, or maybe we think, oh no, I'm just being a good Christian and not asserting myself. So I guess, is there a way to kind of examine ourselves so that we know which way we tend to go?
I'm sorry that I wasn't able to give much more help in that area in my talk. Two comments I would make just very briefly to that. The dominance motive is based on an earlier stage of what's called competence, a sense of having an effect on the world, being good at something, being able to play soccer well or whatever. We get a sense of accomplishment out of that, don't we? Those sort of things that we learn and learn how to do and have skill in. They're the foundation of dominance. They're not dominance themselves, but it's when we compare ourselves, I'm a better soccer player than you, that dominance comes in. It's that foundation that believers are to follow and say, yep, it's good to be good at something. It's good to do this, etc., etc. And when it comes to being put down or being bossy or whatever, as I say, Christians need to kind of sidestep all of that competitiveness and competition and comparison and status seeking, etc., by not being part of it, but by instead saying our task is to love that other person. That's our task. We can't get caught up in all of that dominance business. Our task is to love. And so what's the best thing to do in relation to that person? Now, remember that loving includes a love from an authority person. There's such a thing as authorities in society, and you might think, well, that's dominance. It's kind of like dominance, but it's not really, because it has a different motive to it. So I'm just really signalling that there are complexities to it beyond what I've really described. And I'm happy enough to talk at length about it elsewhere or later, or you might want to look at the book. If you don't want to spend $30 on it, you can get it on Kindle for $11, I think, or something. So yeah, that's about what I'm saying. I'm just pointing to some areas where we're not having to enter that whole system. Not that we can escape from it. We're in it already, but we can escape more and more from it. Less behind.
How can you deal with a Kenyan who has two boys going to Dandenong College, Catholic school, and being a local member presents the awards of the speech night, and yet is the instigator of euthanasia in Victoria?
Right, okay. Yeah, my apologies. I didn't make clear that I was telling a fictitious story. I've never belonged to a political party, and I know nothing beyond what you know about politics. I'm just a layman when it comes to politics. So I don't want to defend anything that the Labor politicians do, and I don't want to condemn them. Just remember that the people who lead us in government, God calls us to respect them. And but if you want to read a little chapter towards the end of the book on Christians and politics and how the theories of motives, dominance, attachment, etc. relate to politics, there's something else in there that you might pursue. But no, I'm not. It was a fictitious story entirely. I don't even drink alcohol, so there's talk about pint, is, again, well, I do drink it, but I just don't like it, that's all.
Thanks so much, Colin. Can we give Colin a hand, please? Well, I found that to be a really wonderful little crash course in some basic human psychology, and also, it was great how you linked it in with faith and how we can try and use our understanding of the human mind, of ourselves and of other people, to try and live out a more Christian life. So thank you very much, Colin. That was wonderful. There's a bucket that's going to come around in a moment. Carmen, could I ask you to pass the bucket around? God is a free event, of course, but if anyone would like to donate a few dollars to help us it helps us to thank our speakers, and also for some other costs that are associated with the event, we'd be very grateful. So there's a bucket coming around, and feel free to throw something in there if you'd like to do that. Colin mentioned his fictitious story of the Labor Party and the election. I just wanted to mention, as I'm sure you all are aware, there's a state election coming up, and I just want to encourage everyone, if you haven't already done it, to take a very close look at the parties and where they stand in relation to the Catholic Church's teaching. So as Catholics, we should try and educate ourselves and understand the different parties' policies and how they relate to the Catholic faith. And if anyone is interested, there's some fantastic guides that the Australian Christian Lobby's put together, where they go through each political party and they've asked them a series of questions that relate to, you know, various moral and social issues, and asked them, you know, where they stand on that. And so it makes it a really easy guide where you can assess each party on these key issues. And if anyone is interested in getting a hold of some of those, and, you know, maybe getting a bunch of them and making them available at your parish so that other people can make an informed judgment at the election about, you know, which party is the best one with regards to the church's teaching, please come and see me, and I'll be happy to help you out with that. You know, many popes and many church documents have encouraged Christians to be involved in politics. You know, we get the government that we deserve, so we should make sure we try and make it a good one. This being the last God and Beer for the year, I'm really keen to get some feedback from people on what's been good, what's been bad, what you'd like to improve, what you'd like to see happen in the future. Are there any speakers that you'd really like to hear from? Are there any topics that you'd really like to see addressed? I'd love to hear that feedback. And there'll be an email that'll be sent around. Hopefully everyone's on the email list. If not, please sign up. You'll get an email with those questions where you can provide your feedback. But I'd be very happy for people to come up and talk to me tonight, and, you know, just pass on any ideas you've got on those questions. So please come up and say good day. And if you're new to God and Beer and you haven't been here before, yeah, please come and say hello. I'd love to meet you and introduce you to some other people as well. So that's all from me. Thanks so much for coming along tonight. Thanks again to Colin, and hope you enjoyed it. God bless.